Hello, I'm Ron Duncan Hart of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and I'd like to welcome you to the program today. As you will see on the screen, the second Iran War, Operation Epic Fury. This will be with Avi Melamed, who's an expert on this information, and I think you'll be surprised at the clarifications that he can make about the conflict. As we start, I want to thank David Schulman and the Israel Committee of Temple Beth Shalom for here in Santa Fe for initiating and supporting this program. We want to thank all of the donors who make these programs possible, especially Nurit Pat for her support for today's program. Avi Melamed is a geopolitical Middle East expert, intelligence analyst, author, and founder of Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives. With a history as a former Israeli intelligence official and senior advisor on Arab affairs, Avi has appeared on NPR, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, NBC, and the Today Show, among others. And it's a pleasure that he can be here with us today. Fluent in Arabic, English, and Hebrew, Melamed is recognized for his understanding of current affairs in the Arab and Muslim world and their implications for Israel and the broader Middle East. His deep familiarity with the Arab and Muslim world has enabled him to anticipate key regional events and to understand them as they're unfolding. After his years as an intelligence officer, he was a fellow of intelligence and Middle Eastern affairs at the Eisenhower Institute in Washington, D.C. And it is my pleasure to welcome Avi Melamed.
Ron, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm very honored to be here today with you. Today is March 22nd, 2026. We are marking today exactly the beginning of the fourth week for what we call the second Iran war. And in my presentation today, I would obviously try to focus in the next 30 minutes trying to understand the dynamic of this war. And I can tell you that, kind of like as a spoiler alert, that I have been illustrating this war from the beginning as what I call the poker game. So today in my presentation, I will try to explain a little bit why do I look at it as a poker game, and we'll try to understand the dynamic of the war through the perspective of the poker game and the regional players involved. I emphasize the regional. I'm kind of like not including currently the United States in that context. Just to start, I know that we had the opportunity to get together previously when I did other presentations. And so with your permission, I would like to start with a very short reminder just to make sure that we are kind of like more or less in the same page before we'll delve into the subject of the dynamic of the war currently and the trajectory maybe ahead. So if you may recall, I was talking in my previous presentation about a very powerful network of semi-state entities / organizations that rose in the Middle East, roughly speaking, during the second part of the 20th century in our time. Network of organizations like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Iraqi Shiite militias, Houthis in Yemen. We have kind of like described this network by the name of the axis of resistance. And we have explained that this network of groups massively supported by the Mullah regime, armed by the Mullah regime, has been acting as a kind of like a subcontractor in the service of the Mullah's regime expansion vision across the Middle East that has been titled under the banner of exporting the Islamic revolution and creating of what has been known by the name of the Shiite Crescent. And we said that one of the major slogans that Axis has been constantly marketing and advancing was the concept of liberating Palestine and eliminating the state of Israel through the use of power. And we have explained how, in course of time, this Axis, particularly in the last couple of decades, was able to create this significant military infrastructure across the region, focusing in arenas that physically border Israel, like Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon, attempts of Hamas and Islamic Jihad to expand presence in the West Bank, the attempts to use Syria also as a sort of like a launching pad to attack Israel. And so we have witnessed how this axis has been able in the last couple of decades to build this infrastructure that we have described as the ring of fire, meaning building this military infrastructure composed of missiles and drones and rockets and militants around Israel's neck under the name of the banner of the ring of fire. And we explained that construction has been part of a larger blueprint for the elimination of the state of Israel. And there was a second component of that blueprint, which we have described as the unifying of the arenas, meaning the time or the day where those infrastructure, the ring of fire, all those arenas that I mentioned before, Gaza Strip and the West Bank and Syria and Lebanon, and in secondary circles also Iraq and Yemen, they all kind of like come together as one, join forces as one, and attacking Israel from all directions, and actually through that basically eliminating the state of Israel. This is a segment that is known by the unifying of the arenas. And we have explained, if you may remember, that actually when Hamas is launching the October 7 attack, Hamas leader is under the impression that indeed the day of unifying of the arenas has come. He has some good reasons to believe that. Just the same, Hamas is launching October 7 attack, expecting his colleagues to the axis, particularly the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the most powerful one in this axis, to join in full capacity, but this did not happen. And actually what happened on the ground, the scenario that evolved since then was quite differently from the one leaders of Hamas were expecting or imagining. In fact, what happened since October 7 and up until today is what we have called in the intelligence community and definition the domino effect of October 7. Now, just before saying a few words about this domino effect, here is something important to understand about the Iranian regime blueprint of expansion across the Middle East. Largely speaking, that has been very effectively and sophisticatedly centered around the concept of two major components. One is to build these expansionist capacities, and the other one is to, at the same time, to create a deterrence image that is non-threatable. And indeed, to a large extent, the Mullah regime was very effectively moving on those two parallel lines. And actually, he was able to do that because it has created a very successful, effective, sophisticated triangle of deterrence that you see in front of you. That triangle of deterrence actually based upon three major components. One is the regime's nuclear program. The other one is the regime's missiles and drones industry and capacities. And the third is the proxy, the axis of resistance, the subcontractors. And the equation is very simple but very effective. The equation was that the Mullah regime constantly said, if you will attack my missiles and drones industries, I'm going to unleash my dogs of war, namely the proxies, and their bite is powerful. If you're going to try to attack my proxies, my axis of resistance, or to disintegrate the axis of resistance, I'm going to use my missiles and drones capacities. If you are going to try to damage my nuclear program, I will use both my missiles and drones as well as the proxy structure against you. In other words, the Mullah regime was, unfortunately, quite successfully building this deterrence capacity. And as a fact, while the Mullah regime has inflicted an unprecedented destruction and death across the region for the last couple of decades, while it has been significantly responsible for the severe destruction or the severe process of radicalization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Mullah regime remained totally intact. It remained totally immune from repercussions and ramifications to its aggressive policy. So as far as the Mullah regime was concerned, this program went very well. So now that we explained that, let's say a few words about this domino effect. So you got October 7 attack. The next day, October 8, Hezbollah is starting to poke Israel's northern border. And before you know that, during 2024, the war between Israel and Hezbollah is expanding and extending. We reached to a pivotal moment. You may remember September 2024, the famous episode with the beepers, the call page beepers, that crippled thousands of Hezbollah's first-line militants. Followed that, there was a significant Israeli strikes, actually wiping out all the leadership of the Hezbollah, including its senior leader Hassan Nasrallah. And so in November 24, there is a ceasefire agreement between Israel and the Lebanese government, which includes the commitment of the Lebanese government to disarm the Hezbollah, a commitment that the Lebanese government simply cannot deliver. Just the same, shortly after the ceasefire in November 2024, within 3 weeks, we witnessed the downfall of Assad regime in Syria. Assad regime was a very significant component in this whole structure that the Iranian regime built. And for the many years of the war in Syria that started in 2011, Iran put in enormous efforts to save Assad regime. And one of the most significant tools Iran used to that end was to deploy Hezbollah in Syria. So the Hezbollah was a major player that secured the endurance of Assad regime rule in Syria. However, following its defeat in the war with Israel in 2024, the Hezbollah was weakened. And so the rebels in Syria identified it as a window of opportunity. And indeed, they launched a massive offensive, backed by Turkey, by the way, and Qatar. And within 2 weeks, they basically toppled down Assad regime because Hezbollah was unable to come to Assad aid. Russia is engaged in the war with Ukraine. Iran was unable to send further forces to Syria. The bottom line, within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, Assad regime went down. And by the end of December, Assad fled to Russia. And the major cornerstone of this axis was collapsing. And that paved the way to the next milestone, and this is the 12 days war between Israel and Iran in 2025, in June 2025. Prior to that, Israel has been taking the advantage of the downfall of Assad regime to wipe out significant Syrian military capacities and particularly anti-aerial capacities. The logic beyond was to pave an aerial corridor that indeed, when the war broke out with Iran in June 2025, Israel enjoyed this aerial corridor stretching from Israel to Iran that enabled the Israeli Air Force to take control over the Iranian skies during that 12 days war. And so, in fact, the 12 days war in June 2025 was the milestone that further led to this current situation, what we call the Second Iran War, or an Operation Epic Fury, that we are now in the midst of that war. So we are looking at the situation on the ground, entering for week 4. We see that the Iranians actually are shooting almost everywhere, in every direction, and we kind of like try to understand, is there any reason with this whole chaos that we see around the region? That brings me to my illustration of the poker game. You know, in a poker game, there are a couple of rules, sort of speaking, or guiding concepts. First, each player needs to identify the cards that it has, meaning the weak and the strong cards. Each player needs to try to identify what's the cards the rivalry has in its possession. And each player is trying to manipulate, bluff, if you wish, in order to try to exhaust as much as possible his powerful card, and yet at the same time to conceal his weak spots, and also at the same time to try and to exhaust as much as possible the weak cards of its rivalry. And to a large extent, when you look at the war right now, beginning of the fourth week of the war, I think that this illustration of this poker game is very, very valid as of now. So let's look first at the Iranian regime. What's the cards that the Iranian poker player holds? It has a couple of very strong cards. First, the fact that it has a very clear strategic objective. He wants to remain in power in the end of the day. He's going to be enormously weakened and shaky and on, but he wants to stay in power. And as far as the regime is concerned, that is in for itself a substantial achievement. Then there is another thing that could be considered as a strong card for the Iranian regime, and that is the fact that the Iranian regime does not look for inner consensus of its people, let alone doesn't care about the well-being of its people. In other words, by doing that, the Iranian regime is basically strengthening its endurance capacity, which is, again, connects or dialogue very well with its strategic objective. It has also significant pressure cards in the sense that, first, geographically, the regime controls major assets, namely, particularly, the ability to disrupt the traffic at the Strait of Hormuz. Some 20% of the world crude oil is going through this narrow strait, let alone the traffic of trade along that significant waterway route. And the other thing that the Iranian regime can use also, geographically speaking, is the fact that it is very close to major hubs of energy suppliers, namely its Arab Gulf neighbors, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. These are the Arab Gulf monarchies. They are significant suppliers of energy around the world. And indeed, identifying those sweet, strong cards, the Mullah regime immediately translated it into a very simple action. It's basically fair. Put closure or half closure on the Hormuz Strait. By doing that, putting some pressure on the global economy. And second, he started from first day one, to attack its neighbors, aiming at their infrastructure, the energy infrastructure capacities, namely refineries and gas stations and so on. The whole idea beyond it is very simple. The idea is to create a worldwide economic crisis, thus put pressure on the United States of America to stop the war. At the same time, the Iranian regime has some weak cards in its possession. First, it is sustaining a significant accumulating damage. He's losing capacities, he's losing its military industry that he has been spending hundreds of billions of dollars developing all those years. With every day that goes by, he's basically losing power, and in parallel to that, his governmental capacities is weakening as well. And so the accumulative impact of that, among other things, could be, for example, that it could reignite the uprising of the Iranian people, an uprising that was, you may remember, brutally oppressed in last January by the Iranian regime. If the Iranian people will once again storm the street and take the streets, that will be in a totally different context because the Iranian regime is going to be significantly weakened. So this is yet another weak card, sort of. Another thing is the erosion of deterrence. It's very clear that every day that goes by with all the damage the Iranian regime sustained, his whole deterrence equation is being significantly compromised, and it's kind of like a new ball game in town, sort of speaking, very much different from the one that the Iranian regime enjoyed all those decades. And finally, the continuation of the war with all these accumulative impacts that I mentioned, together with the fact that now Israel is engaging in an expanding war with the Hezbollah, the most significant executive arm of the Iranians, which has been significantly weakened already. This is part of the weakening of this whole axis of resistance, which, as far as the Iranian regime, yet again meaning a significant compromise of its ability to continue and to dictate its radical agenda. So all in all, the bottom line is that the Iranian regime still plays with these cards, and at this point is still raising the bet. What about Israel? Well, Israel's strong cards, of course, is the fact that it enjoys a military superiority in terms of the intelligence, the air force controlling the sky, obviously the close, tight cooperation with CENTCOM, United States of America, the technological and the intelligence capacities are demonstrated day in, day out, to the point, actually, Israel and the United States of America totally dominate the Iranian skies with all the ramifications that come along with that. In Israel, there is an internal consensus regarding the justification of that war and the need to, not to say eliminate, if possible, but clearly to diminish significantly the scale of the threat the Mullah regime presents to the state of Israel. Israel presents a pressure cards, for example, in the sense that Israel is now eroding Hezbollah, which is the major external hand of the Iranian regime. Every day that goes back, and similarly, like it's going to further expand. So in that regard, these are some of the strong cards Israel is playing with. The weak cards Israel has is first the fact that its strategic objective is not so clear. It's not so clear whether it's about mostly toppling down the regime or eliminating the Iranian missiles industries or eliminating the axis of resistance. There has been some vague or unclarity in that regard, which is opposite to the Iranian regime. Another weak thing is the endurance capacity. In that regard, there are a couple of objective segments that Israel must take into consideration, like the fact that it does not have an unlimited both defensive as well as offensive capacities to continue such a war for a long period of time. The other thing is that, differently from the Iranian, who couldn't care less about his people, the Israeli government, of course, has to take into consideration the endurance capacities of the people. It's now week 4. Obviously, you can understand people are in and out from the shelters on a daily basis. Obviously, routine has been so totally compromised. And so it's a very challenging reality to operate in. So you could understanding that in the end of the day, it's not something that could go on, without time limits or restrictions. And then there is another, I would say, weak card, and that is in the sense that Israel needs to synchronize its tactical objectives, which is relatively the more easy part to do, than the strategic perspective or objectives, and particularly the priorities of the strategic perspectives. And here it's very significant because Israel and the United States, and obviously informally the Arab Gulf monarchies that are also attacked by Iran, are kind of like in the same camp, but though they have similar strategic priorities and interests and objectives, they are not identical. And they have their own inner pace and priorities and dynamic. And so there is a need of these semi-partners to synchronize. And in that regard, it's very clear that in the end of the day, the one who makes the call is the United States President Donald Trump, who in that regard, as you probably know, made last night a very dramatic announcement, basically presenting the Iranian regime with an ultimatum to lift the partial siege on the Hormuz Strait within 48 hours. As you could understand, the whole region is now looking to see what's going to be the next phase in the context of that. The Arab Gulf monarchies, similar to the Iranian, the Arab Gulf monarchies, at least formally, has a clear objective, and that is to end the war. The war, obviously, it causes them a lot of damage. And they would like to see the war comes to an end. They would like very much to see, in the end of the day, the Mullah regime evaporating, but they assess, quite logically, that it's not going to happen, at least not in the foreseeable future. And so basically, they kind of like tends to come to terms with the existence of that regime, though significantly weakened, rather than to exist in a situation where there is no regime that controls Iran, a 90 million people nation, and a nation that theoretically could result in a situation of a total chaos that will spill into their territories. The other thing, that is kind of like in the strong cards, or speaking of the Arab Gulf, is the internal consensus of their population. The fact that they found themselves in a situation they have been totally not exposed to, at least definitely not in the scales that they are exposed now, meaning the sense that their civil centers are directly targeted day in, day out, yet they are continue to maintain a control, they continue to maintain routine, which is of course very significant in such times. They also have in their possession two major pressure cards. One is the fact that they do have a very, at least some of them, mostly Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, have a very significant offensive capacities. We are looking at two states that are equipped and armed with the best of Western weapons. They have a significant air force capacities that could be used. And if it's going to be used, that could be a very significant game changer, because they don't have, unlike the Israeli Air Force that flies in and out 1,500 miles each direction, they don't have to fly 1,500 miles. They don't have to do refueling in the sky. They could do in a couple of minutes fly and cause significant damages to this Iranian infrastructure. Up until now, they basically refrain from using that offensive capacities, though they have been said that they are recontemplating using that. So far, they are using their defense capacities. The other pressure cards they have is the fact that the Iranian financial system, to a large extent, is woven to the financial systems in the Arab Gulf monarchies. And that is something that the Arab Gulf monarchies could exhaust or leverage by suffocating or freezing assets that belongs to the Iranian. In terms of the weak cards, well, they are very vulnerable, as you could understand. We talked about the fact that they are totally exposed, actually, to the Iranian attacks, particularly their infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, which is their major source of income. Thus, their ability to endure in such situation for a long period of time, again, like Israel, is quite limited, which is, of course, a very significant component. Again, like Israel, they do also need to synchronize strategic priorities. And again, they, in the end of the day, they have to be tuned to the decision done by the United States President Donald Trump. And the proxies of the Iranians, the axis of resistance, well, as I said before, right now we are witnessing the expanding of the war between Israel and Hezbollah, a trajectory that is expected to continue and linger even if the war will come to an end. And this is something that has a lot of significant ramifications. Again, taking into consideration that the Hezbollah basically occupied its homeland in Lebanon, and basically became the most powerful executive arm of the Iranians in the region, but the Hezbollah has been significantly weakened, both militarily and politically, since October 7. And now it seems like there is a determination within Israeli policymaking and security circles to move on with further decimating and eliminating military capacities of the Hezbollah, with the purpose of, in the end of the day, taking advantage of this unique conjunction of Hezbollah being politically weakened inside Lebanon. He's being criticized across the board. Most of the Lebanese view Hezbollah as an Iranian agent that actually occupied Lebanon. They want Hezbollah to disappear, to disarm itself. It's not going to disappear, but the combination of this increasing across the board Lebanese criticism on the Hezbollah with the weakening of its military capacity and the further dissemination of its military capacities could result in the end of the day, the fact that Hezbollah will not any longer be able to continue and to dictate its radical agenda, as it was unfortunately able to do in the last couple of decades. Another significant player that we should follow closely are Houthis in Yemen. Houthis are not necessarily proxies of the Iranians. neither total executive arm, but to a large extent they are tuned to the Iranian regime needs because mostly their military capacity has been built by Iran. And the Houthis has the capacity to cause significant damage, to hold a significant pressure card in the shape of what they did in the past, and that is to jeopardize and attack traffic at the narrow Bab el-Mandab Strait that you see in front of you on the map. This is the narrow bottleneck connecting the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea. This is the bridge between Asia on the one side and Africa on the other side, connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea through the Suez Canal. Up until now, Houthis have been standing on the sidelines. Here and there has been some signals that allegedly saying that the Houthis are going to step in. It didn't happen thus far. It's not clear whether it's going to happen. Some attribute the Houthis' muteness, sort of speaking, to the fact that they don't really want to be dragged to this war, witnessing the might that the United States exercise in the region, the Israeli military might. They see what happens in Iran. And if they will be kind of like jeopardizing global traffic, they may find themselves facing a NATO coalition, which of course would be a bad news for the Houthis, who already are engaged in an inner fight against the rivalries in Yemen. There is another argument that says that actually they are waiting for the right time in coordination with the Iranians to step in. I cannot evaluate which of the one is the true and the accurate one, but I would say just the same, we should all the time follow very closely to see what's going to happen with the Houthis, particularly now against what I said before, mentioned the ultimatum that President Trump presents the Iranian with regarding the Strait of Hormuz. And finally, looking down the road, I would say again, it seems like that across the board, there is understanding that in the end of the day, we are looking at a trajectory that should end up in going back to a diplomatic track. There are different estimations about the endurance of the war, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. It's all very much, contemplation that I don't know to say to what extent they are accurate. And so I would say that we should, in the end of the day, look at a scenario where there is a return to some sort of like diplomatic track. Obviously, the major question is what will be the conditions of that return. In that regard, I would say that I think that at least in the foreseeable future, the downfall of the regime is less likely to take place. The regime still exercises ability to continue and to manage and control, even though it has been compromised. But I would say at the same time that we could expect that an outcome of the war and the significant damage the regime sustained, together with the crippling sanctions and the significant challenges Iran is facing economically and so on, we could expect some sort of like a long-term process of a gradual reconfiguration of political power that will be kind of like manifested, roughly speaking, to put it in a sense of like more accurate and just representation of the Iranian people in the power centers and the political power centers in Iran. And maybe down the road, that will be the foundation that will result in some very dramatic shift of power in Iran, in the sense that it will result in, as we all hope, a totally new government in Iran that will be totally new player in the region, that will play ball with the region and will be constructive and not destructive. But this is something that I would say seems to be like, at this point at least, beyond the horizon line. And finally, I think that we could expect the further weakening of the axis of resistance, at least, of course, when we are looking at the short-term period of time. And once again, the most significant aspect in that regard is what I mentioned before, the expanding and widening war between Israel and Hezbollah, which to the best of my analysis is likely to continue, even if the war with Iran will come to an end, because it seems like the Israeli policymakers and security circles are determined to once and for all end this threat that the Hezbollah presents for decades to the state of Israel and to the Lebanese people. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I'm concluding my presentation and opening this session to your questions.
Okay. Thank you, Avi, for bringing us to this point and sharing this information. I have a couple of questions to start with before we look at the questions from the audience. One of them on the side of Israel, the prospect is that Israel will be emerging from these series of conflicts from last June up to the present, emerging as the dominant military power in the Middle East. Iran is being significantly downgraded. That was the polar opposite for Israel up till now. What does this imply for Israel and the Middle East if Israel emerges as the dominant military presence in that part of the world?
Well, I could reflect the discussion in the region vis-a-vis that specific aspect. In the Arab world, it's very interesting. There are two kind of like perspectives on the Israel as a dominant military power. There is across the board indeed understanding that Israel is exercising an outstanding, unprecedented military capacities, the intelligence capacities, the technological capacities, and so on. It did not skip the eyes of the region. Interesting enough, that superiority is kind of like translated in the Arab language in a way discussion in two different ways. One is basically say, okay, this is a major power in the region. We definitely want to, associate with that power, particularly when it shows the ability to such both offensive and defensive capacities. But then there is another perspective that actually expressed concern in the Arab world, in the region, basically saying, this is a power that has aggressive expansional vision. They attribute that to the fact that there are some circles within Israel, namely the Israeli ultranational right wing, that are talking openly about expanding Israel's geographical borders and taking areas in Lebanon and in Gaza Strip, and which, by the way, is not something that most of the Israelis stand for. Just the same, it fuels those concerns in the Arab region, in the Arab discussion. So these are the two sentiments that are kind of like current prevalent in the Arab discussion across the board. One way or another, it's very clear that from a, I would say, strategic military perspective, when you look at the whole balance of powers in the region, it's very clear that Israel comes across as a very substantial power that nobody can ignore. We just have to remind ourselves that in the end of the day, there are other powers in the region, like, for example, Turkey. It has to be, of course, taken into consideration. So, yes, indeed, that will be significantly, I would say, one of the major things that in the end of the day define the role and position of Israel in this reconstructed geostrategical landscape of the region.
The other question that I have is on the side of Iran. So Iran's military capacity is being significantly degraded. It's lost its top leadership. But the thing that I keep hearing is the hardening of resistance among the hardline in mullahs and in the power structure of Iran. And hearing even that the new Ayatollah, the son, is very resentful because of his loss of his father, his wife, his daughter, and that there's this hardening of resistance, which suggests that the regime might go to all extreme measures, but it will not fall. Could you comment on that?
Yes, well, look, the hard line exists already. It's been there since day one. I mean, when this regime is chanting death to Israel and death to America, it's not only just slogan. I mean, at least when you look from the Israeli perspective, that regime has been promoting a blueprint, an action plan to eliminate the state of Israel. As I mentioned before, the story of the Ring of Fire and the unifying of the arenas. The Mullah regime is, we should have no mistakes. This is a regime that is enormously dangerous and hurtful. This is a regime that caused an enormous death and destruction across the Middle East. This is a regime that's responsible for the killing of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, the demolition of states in Syria, in Iraq, the demolition in Gaza Strip, the damage to Israel, the damage to Lebanon. This is a regime that has been cynically, brutally, and gladly sacrificing large parts of the Middle East at the altar of its vision. We should be very clear about it. And so there is no extra incentive for that regime to be further radical, because in its essence, it's very radical. As for the allegedly new leader, which it's not very clear what exactly his situation like, Mushtaba Khomeini. Indeed, it was reported that he's a hardline and maybe is going to be further incentivized by personal revenge, but it doesn't really make any difference as far as Israel is concerned. Again, as I explained before, because the hardliner are already built in this regime. I think that more interesting to see will be whether there will be, as part of this reconfiguration of political power, whether there will be an inner process that in the end of the day, the new regime in Iran will still contain those hardliners, but they will be basically kind of like more cornered or niched, given to needs of pragmatic calculations. That is the thing to follow and to see. And so I think that will be the significant thing to follow. But it has to be reemphasized. This regime is enormously dangerous regime. It has been proven. It's not about theoretical assumptions.
Yeah. The other issue, this is the Shiite regime. The large part of the Muslim world and the Arab world in the Middle East is Sunni. The exact numbers I'm not sure, but it's something like 90% Sunni and 10 or 85, 90% Sunni, 10 or 15% Shiite. So, and in a sense, the Shiites are also against the Sunni nations. I mean, they're Muslim, but the Shiites, as I understand, think they should control the holy sites, Mecca and Medina, which means it's the confrontation with the Sunni world. So in a way, the fact that Israel has taken on the fight with Iran and the Shiites, can we say that Israel, in a sense, has been doing the fight that the Sunni nations have stayed away from doing?
Well, you can definitely say so. I mean, look, you accurately pointed out that this part of this radical ideology of the regime is to do with the power struggle, the ancient power struggle between Sunnis and Shiites in the Muslim world.
Yeah.
A power struggle that has been going on for the last 1400 years since Islam emerged on the stage of history. And indeed, the Mullah regime, as I mentioned before, in the last couple of decades, actually, practically speaking, was bragging, and not without base, bragging and saying to the Arab world, we, the Shiite Mullah regime of Iran, we control Arab, predominantly Sunni states. We control Lebanon, we control Syria, we control Iraq, we control Yemen, we control the Gaza Strip, and to a large extent, it was not an exaggeration. Now, the ironic thing is that the Arab world actually, other than complaining and condemning and such things, was basically helpless. The Arab world viewed the Mullah regime taking over Arab countries. And in the end of the day, the Arab world was not able to save their brothers with all the rhetoric and the statements and the condemnation and so on and so on and so on. As a matter of fact, Syria, a major Arab state, was occupied by the Iranians. Assad regime became an Iranian lackey. And at first, the Arab world basically, kicked out Assad regime from the Arab League for what he has done for the Syrian people. But then, at some point, when it seems like that if Assad and the Iranians won the war, and it's a fait accompli, and Syria became an Iranian satellite. The Arab world took Assad back into the Arab League, and Arab world again turned to Syria. And so, ironically speaking, while the Arab world has been mostly dealing with rhetoric and condemning and telling himself stories about how he was able to confront the Iranians and the Shiites, while meanwhile the reality was very different, the only factor that in the end of the day offers the Arab world the ability to get free of this Iranian suffocating grip is no other than Israel. The ultimate example of that is the story of Lebanon. Lebanon was occupied from within by Iran and the Hezbollah. The Lebanese are saying that, and they're right.
Yeah, yeah.
And all those years, the Lebanese have been, complaining and whining and crying that the Hezbollah has occupied them and the Iranian occupied them, and so on and so on. Meanwhile, they have been constantly busy blaming and holding Israel accountable and holding Israel as the enemy constantly, while the real enemy is the Hezbollah that was occupying Lebanon from within. But the Lebanese are unable to get free of the Hezbollah suffocating grip. So ironically speaking, now Lebanon has a chance, for the first time since Hezbollah emerged on its stage in the beginning of the 1980s, Lebanon has the opportunity to regain its sovereignty and get free of the Iranian suffocating grip and the Hezbollah suffocating grip. Who offered the Lebanese that chance and opportunity? The state of Israel. It is Israeli soldiers that play with their blood. It are Israeli citizens that play with the destruction of communities in Israel, who are basically offering the Lebanese people their freedom and independence. And so, talking about irony of the region, there you go. This is a great irony.
We have a number of questions that have come in, and let's take a look at these. Let's see. Philip Stern says, what is the likelihood the U.S. will invade the Cork Island? And if it were to do that, what's the chance of success?
Well, the Kharj Island is an island located some 20 miles offshore the Iranian shoreline. It's north of the Hormuz Strait. This island is an enormously significant milestone or cornerstone in the whole Iranian oil infrastructure. In fact, 9 of 10s of every oil barrel that goes out from Iran is going to this island. This is the nervous, sort of speaking, center. There has been reports allegedly about U.S. plans to occupy the island or to cripple the ability of the Iranians to continue to use the island. I don't know to assess the seriousness of those reports. I definitely cannot rule it out. In fact, as we are taking into consideration the ultimatum that President Trump made yesterday, the clock is ticking. He basically says to the Iranian, you got 48 hours to lift the partial siege, or I'm going to eliminate your major power center. So we definitely look at the island very closely to see how things are going to evolve there. I don't know to say from a military perspective. I'm not a military expert, so I cannot refer to that. And so I would also mention in that regard some 3 other islands that are not present in the discussion, but we should pay attention. There are 3 islands, smaller islands, that are close to the Hormuz Strait. They are called Abu Musa, Tunab the Greater, and Tunab the Lesser. And it's interesting because these are 3 islands. Only Abu Musa is populated, mostly by Iranian forces. The rest 2 other islands are not populated. But they are located in a very strategic location, and they are controversial. There is a controversy between Iran and the United Arab Emirates regarding the ownership of those islands. In fact, the UAE argued that the Iranian occupied those islands. And just today, it seems like those islands are back into the picture because there has been a threat by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards to the United Arab Emirates, basically saying, don't try to take opportunity to make facts on the ground in the context of those 3 islands. So I will definitely also look at those 3 islands that are rarely present in the Western discussion. So that's the reason I'm bringing them to the Western discussion.
Following up on what you were just now mentioning, David Schulman asks if Trump actually were to carry out the threat of bombing their electric infrastructure, what can you predict that would happen?
Well, look, the most recent information coming in just before we started this session, I was kind of like looking at some Arab platforms. There are some, I don't know to say, reports or signals about some sort of like an attempt to do last moment beyond the scene conversations involving some regional countries that aims to find some sort of like a solution before this ultimatum expires. I think there is a consensus that actually says currently that President Trump means business. That is exactly at least what is coming out from the discussion in the region. In other words, they're saying President Trump says and he's doing. So it's not an empty rhetoric. Therefore, there is an assumption that when President Trump, at least in the discussion in the region, that they are saying if President Trump said 48 hours ultimatum, he means that. We should take that seriously. The question is to what extent the Iranians are taking it seriously as well. I think that we could say cautiously that the Iranians starts to maybe understand that they should take that seriously. And that maybe relates to this incoming reports allegedly about some sort of like an attempt, a diplomatic attempt beyond the scenes. I don't know to say at this point to what extent it's serious and where it's going to lead to. Definitely something to follow within the upcoming hours. Again, because we are in this within time frame of the ultimatum that was set by President Trump. There is, of course, a need here to do some significant belly dancing by all sides in order to try to find a diplomatic way to get out of this bottleneck. We'll have to see and think how things will evolve. I think that the most significant thing in that regard is going back to the illustration of the poker game, is going to the part of assessing the rivalries, capacities, assessing the rivalries' intentions, and to what extent are you accurately reading the manipulative moves by your rivalry. When I look at that from this perspective, going back to the poker game, I must say that it seems to me right now that there has been some sort of like underestimation by the Iranian side regarding the moves of President Trump and the way that he plays the cards. I don't want to be decisively saying that, but I think that maybe, if I read between the lines, there is some growing understanding within the Iranian regime that they may misread or underestimate the way Trump is playing the cards. And so maybe, and I'm saying it maybe there will be some sort of like growing willingness within the Iranian part to move towards some sort of like exit point, particularly against the background of this threat or ultimatum that President Trump was doing. But again, it's a very fluid situation. It's a very significant moment that could basically split into two possible scenarios. One is reduction of the hostilities, and if there is some sort of like a diplomatic understanding, and reduction of the hostilities and starting to move towards an exit point, or a significant deterioration within the next 48 hours. We'll have, of course, to see how things will evolve.
We have questions from two different persons, Ken Grossman and Robert Olesh, that have to do with China and its impact in this process. And Grossman particularly asks about the offer of China to supply supersonic missiles to Iran as a part of this conflict. Can you talk about the implications of this China connection?
Well, to do it very simply, I am familiar with that report. I have no ability to evaluate whether this report is accurate, partially accurate, has a base or doesn't have a base. So I just don't want to speculate on that. I simply does not have any knowledge on that issue.
Okay. And another question that comes from an anonymous attendee Can you explain the true nature of the Iranian people, or can you talk about it? What are the reasons they're rising up and they're generally in favor? See if they do rise up, what would a change look like?
Well, look, when we're talking about Iran, obviously a huge nation, 90 million people, a great civilization, a great legacy. Iran has a couple of interesting identity features. One, it has a multi-ethnical groups. You got Persians and Baluchis and Azaris and Kurds and Turkmenistans and Afghans and Arabs. The list goes on and on and on. So it's a tapestry of many different ethnical groups. The other thing is that, yes, Shiite is the religion of most of the Iranians, but there are also Sunni Iranians, including Sunni Arabs. You got the area of Baluchistan in the eastern part of Iran. You got Khuzestan, which most of its residents are Shiite Arabs, not Persians. And so it's a tapestry of a multi-ethnical groups. Then there is another aspect of Iran, and that is some sort of like a tension between its like religious traditional identities and the identities of its ethnical group and the particularly in our times, the growing tendency and affiliation of the young generation with liberal Western openness. We have to remember that majority of the Iranian young people were born into the reality of Islamic Shiite regime ruling Iran. They didn't live under any other kind of different mechanism or rule. And obviously, we see that they are the one, in the end of the day, kind of like a major component in this whole uprising. Now, they are joined by many segments within the Iranian people, particularly against the background that they are not only oppressed by this regime, but not less significant to remind ourselves. Iran is crumbling in every possible aspect. I mean, this is a nation that deals with an enormous challenges, water crisis, electricity, gas, unemployment, severe social challenges, crumbling infrastructure, transportation systems, in every possible aspect. To a large extent, the Mullah regime dragged Iran into abyss. And all those things are fueling an anger of people. This anger has been accumulating over the years. It has been playing a significant role in the repeating expressions of discontent, riots, and in course of time, they have been further intensified because the regime brutally oppressed all those protests, and the oppression further fueled sentiments of process. So the bottom line is that when you look at that, you see that the young generation obviously plays a very significant role, and the cumulative impact of all that is, in the end of the day, resulting to a repeating rounds of uprising. And now, as I said before, in a new reality where the Mullah regime is much, much, much weaker than it was before the beginning of this war, a new uprising of the Iranian people, should it occur, if it will occur, will find the regime in a much more challenging situation. And to that, I will add a very significant component that we should note and be aware of, and this is the issue of the Iranian army. Iran is armed forces parallel to the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. And this is a major body that up until now, in a way, kind of like is on the sideline. I mean, the attacks are focusing on the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards' assets and capacities. The attacks are almost constantly crippling the capacities, the military capacities that are the spine of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. The attacks also focus on the Basij, this paramilitia that is basically the one in Iran responsible for the oppression of the uprising of the Iranian people. The army, relatively speaking, is kind of like on the sideline, relatively speaking, and there are seeds of tension between the army and the regime, between the army and the IRGC. I think that one of the interesting things to follow will be the story of the Iranian army, and what will happen if in a scenario of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Iranians streaming the streets, and they are being shot at. as it happened during the last oppression of the uprising, shot at by their own brothers, the Basij, in a scenario or in a situation where the regime is much, much weaker, it will be interesting to see what's going to happen with the army. Because in the end of the day, this is the armed forces of Iran. These are people that are part and parcel of the Iranian people. So I would definitely also look at the place of the army, the Iranian army, in an upcoming possible scenarios.
If we have chance for one last question, there are a number of questions we're not going to be able to get to given our time. But Consuelo Luz asked the question that given a reduced power of Iran, looking at Iran as a primary projector of the jihadi movement in the Middle East, can you speculate or can you anticipate what changes might occur in the Middle Eastern world, looking at the Sunni countries, for example, if there is a decreased promoter of the jihadi movement?
Well, first, I would not necessarily combine the story of the mullah regime with jihadi concept. The jihadi concept is more related to, let's say, the Sunni camp, the Sunni radical camp. But I would say something like that it's very clear, as I said before, the mullah regime has been a significant destabilizer of the large parts of the Middle East, particularly the area that is the whole area that stretches between the Mediterranean Sea all the way to Iran and down to Yemen. In other words, the mullah regime, unfortunately, has been very successfully expanding its influence across this region, and it has been done through violence, through terrorizing, through bloodshed, while, as I mentioned before, the mullah regime remained totally intact. And so one can understand that if you cripple, let alone eliminate such a destabilizing factor, it's a good news for the region. Definitely something that could help for further stabilization of this region. Now, one example which is very significant is in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The mullah regime and its expansionist program was the major contributor, quote unquote, to the escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is the mullah regime that has been fueling the escalation. It is the mullah regime that has been building Hamas military capacities and Islamic Jihad military capacities and Hezbollah's capacities. For the mullah regime, the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been an ace that they played very sophisticatedly. And basically, their interest was very simple: to make sure that the conflict will not only continue, but it will further escalate. And indeed, that's what happened. When you look at the story of the conflict for the last 4 decades, ever since the mullah regime came to power, and particularly ever since Hamas rose to power in the late 1980s, and particularly in the last 2 decades following Hamas takeover of Gaza Strip 7, you see how the conflict has enormously deteriorated and militarized. Because the mullah's regime, that's the mullah's regime interest. It has been a very powerful card the mullah regime has been able to play. So the mullah regime wanted the conflict to continue endlessly. It wanted the conflict to continue and to escalate. And indeed, Israelis and Palestinians paid enormously for that. Lebanese paid enormously for that. So now, if the mullah regime, as hopefully is going to be significantly crippled, let alone if the mullah regime goes down, the meaning of that is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is entering a totally new trajectory. With the absence of such player that could continue and to fuel the flames of the conflict, we could definitely expect a totally new trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that will be hopefully much more positive in the comparison to the trajectory thus far. So this is an example of the potential ramifications of eliminating, reducing, diminishing the ability of the mullah regime to continue and to impact and dictate its radical agenda on the region, as unfortunately it has been able to do thus far.
Avi, thank you so much for being with us today on short notice and for bringing this insight and the information to understand this conflict. And we look forward to the possibility of continuing conversations, hopefully in better circumstances. So.
Okay. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the stage.